We are in part 19 of this series. In Mark chapter 10, we have come to this place in Mark's Gospel. Before I begin to look into this text, I want to just say a more general word about preaching about marriage in your churches as you graduate and go forth. Many people object to, you will find some at least in the church that will object to the pastor's preaching on marriage in churches because of concern of single people present or divorced people and so forth that are in the congregation. In more recent years, this has spilled over into a dismantling of Mother's Day and Father's Day, which have been dropped out of many churches out of concerns for peoples who have not been called to singleness or feel unable to have children, etc. But as pastors, of course, it's so important to interact with all of these situations in a pastoral way because that's part of our work. We have to also learn how to teach our people better thinking about these type things. The commandment, the fifth commandment, to honor your father and mother, cannot be bracketed out of the church. We really need to discuss this and preach about texts like this as they come forward. Just as a reminder, the passage that is, of course, in the Ten Commandments in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, as well as in Ephesians 6, to honor your father and mother, does say, honor your father and mother. The command is not to honor your motherhood or your fatherhood. It's to honor your mother and father. And all of us have mothers and fathers. And so it's very important that we see this command as something for all of us to celebrate and to pray for our parents, thank God for our parents. Even when there's been pain and dysfunction, we can also thank God for even those brief fleeting moments and look for us in our own formation to be better mothers and fathers in our own way. This, of course, applies to marriage as well. Whether you're married or single or divorced, we are ourselves part of this great institution of marriage by virtue of the fact that we are someone's children. We are part of some family. So with that, we don't skip over this pericope. We go right to it, and we come now to this 10th chapter of Mark's Gospel. This chapter is filled with mostly teachings of Christ to his disciples. So in that sense, it's part of the whole post-Caesarea Philippi block of Mark, which is mostly teaching the disciples, but it's also joined with it some opposition with religious leaders of the day. So the opposition to Christ is building in these final chapters of Mark. This particular passage is pretty powerful, and that brings together both of these, some very amazing teachings by Jesus as well as the opposition of the Pharisees. This particular text comes in a class of text where Jesus' teaching arises out of, in this case, Pharisees seeking to trap Jesus. It's quite interesting that in this particular case, the Pharisees aren't really that interested in learning about Jesus' views about anything or to deepen their own knowledge about marriage. The Pharisees are using this as a way of trapping Jesus. There are several texts like this, like, for example, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? This is not really about taxes. It's trying to trap Jesus, and this is exactly what happens here. The great thing about it is that Jesus uses this very inauspicious opening by the Pharisees with very mixed motives at best on their part to actually give us what's widely regarded as the most powerful teaching on marriage in the New Testament. And in fact, this particular text, the 6-9 part of this text, is the most quoted marriage liturgy in every tradition. Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Independent, Anglican, it's there. Even the Pentecostals do it. Yes. So it's a pretty important passage. Just joking. Now, the text begins in verse 2 where the Pharisees come and they ask Jesus the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Verse 2. Now, Jesus instantly gets the whole entrapment thing. He understands right where it's going. So Jesus comes right to it. He comes to the table, puts on the table, verse 3. He says, well, what does Moses command to you? And they say, so they were going to try to put a wedge between Jesus and Moses. That was kind of the trick. It's a very common trick even today to put evangelicals like some wedge with the Old Testament. You know, oh, you don't sow your field with two kinds of seed. Oh, why can't you obey any commandment or whatever? Very common thing. So Jesus is way out ahead of them. So Jesus says, okay, what did Moses command? They say, Moses commanded that a man can simply write a certificate of divorce and send his wife away. Now, Jesus at this point is very interesting. And when Jesus does this, of course, this quotation from the Pharisees is a reference to Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. Now, they were horrible exegetes. They would not pass. I mean, Bill Arnold is here, surely. Is Bill Arnold here? Bill Arnold, they would not pass Bill Arnold's class, okay? He would give them the proverbial red card. Because this passage has nothing to do, passage is not about Moses legislating for a man to send a woman away with a certificate of divorce. If you look at the passage carefully, it's a series of if statements. If a man does this because he finds something indecent in his wife, we aren't told exactly what that is. If she goes and marries another man, if that man gives her another certificate of divorce, sends her away, or if he dies and she comes back, if all that happens, if she comes back to her first husband, he cannot marry her again. The whole point of it is to actually restrict the glib use of this practice and to hold back on easy divorce rather than some kind of encouragement for making it easier. But what's interesting for us is that Jesus does not address that. He does not say anywhere in this text, boy, you guys are horrible exegetes. He didn't do that. And I think it's really important to note that he doesn't and why he doesn't do that. Because actually Jesus understands, as all of us must in leadership, that there's a big difference between a presenting issue and the deeper malady. And Jesus cuts right through the presenting issue to the deeper issue that's involved. I learned a long time ago that whenever someone comes to you in the church or anywhere, any ministry you're involved in, and someone says something to you or complains about something or brings up an issue or whatever, that's a text. That's a very important text. You have to listen to it. But that text comes in a context and often reveals a subtext. There's a text, context, and subtext to almost everything that's said. And so Jesus is aware of that. There's a whole subtext going on beneath this, which he is going to cut right through. So in this response to Jesus, he opens up by saying, well, it's because of your hearts were hard that Moses allowed this. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And notice what Jesus does. He brings them back to creation. He understands that there are many times in situations where you're in kind of a presenting issue, a kind of entrapment of various kinds, and you've got to go back, reset the whole thing, and get the whole thing established on the proper foundations. That's what he does by going back to creation. He then presents, as I said, what is this amazing teaching. He says, at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his mother and father, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. Remember the old liturgy used to say, man never puts asunder. I can still hear, it's been 30 years, we were married 30 years ago. My dear wife is sitting right here. And I can still hear Gordon Fee. We were married by Gordon Fee, New Testament professor. I can still him saying, let man never put asunder. That says ring in my ears. For 30 years now. It's still sticking. Now, we live in a time where those verses 6 to 9, what Jesus articulates as the original design and purpose of marriage is mostly incomprehensible to our larger society. Now, it is mostly incomprehensible. It doesn't mean it's totally incomprehensible. It's mostly incomprehensible. It's like that line in, what is the guy in Princess Bride, Billy Crystal, who says, he's not dead, he's mostly dead. This teaching is not incomprehensible. It's mostly incomprehensible. But we have to be aware of that when we walk into the larger culture, and we have to deal with that. And there's a whole another sermon I'd like to preach at some other point. Sorry, Justin, this thing will never stop. But on how to talk about marriage in the wider culture. That's a very important thing. We have to deal with that too. But we must first get it right in our own context. We must first restore our own understanding of marriage, because today the very nature of marriage is under attack. It's been lost. The whole notion of design has been dropped out of the conversation, the cultural conversation, even in the Christian conversation. So your ministry will undoubtedly be framed by a wide range of presenting issues around divorce, remarriage, sexual activity outside of marriage, fornication, adultery, premarital sex, pornography addictions, homosexual behavior, same-sex marriages, homosexual ordination, commodification of marriage, child molestation, living together outside of marriage, the secret world of lust, and then there must be many others. Those are the ones that come to my mind. Now, the focus in recent years on homosexual same-sex marriages, we must remind ourselves pretty regularly that this is one issue in a whole range of sexual brokenness in our culture. All right? This is, and not to diminish that, it's just that it's a very big, wide, long list of brokenness. And if I had a sanctification wand, where someone said to me, the Lord said to me, you can wave the sanctification wand, and in one instant you could get rid of all the pornography in the church or all the same-sex homosexuality. I'd get rid of the pornography immediately. Not because the other is less serious, but because it's so deeply pervasive. And so I think sometimes we often let presenting issues also keep us from really dealing deeply with the real deep brokenness in our society and in the church, because we never have actually properly addressed and rediscovered the proper purpose and design of marriage. And so this is where we stand. We hardly can say that the church is currently shining forth with a stunning alternative to the world. So it seems to me that we have to get our own house in order. We have a lot to do in this area along this whole spectrum, and let's start there. In our case, arguing essentially the homosexual behavior or same-sex marriage issues or any of these problems, pornography, etc., none of it happens in a vacuum. And so we must see this as simply signs and pointers to how we've distorted God's design for marriage. And yet we also must understand by rediscovering God's design, it actually addresses all of these issues. It puts them all in their proper place. And so it also, and by the way, not only would it help us to reestablish our own understand the design of marriage, but it also gives us this joyful ability and renewed capacity to find extravagant ways, yes, extravagant ways to love people who've been through painful divorces, extravagant ways to love homosexual people who are entrapped in various ways. We have a lot of loving to do once we recognize God's design for marriage. Okay, so it's wrong to pretend that only one thing is on that list. It's also wrong to try to normalize anything on that list. All of these things are signs of sexual brokenness. So we must move away from presenting problems and go back to creation itself. And this design, which will separate us from all sexual brokenness, whether it be easy first century certificates of divorce, or a man turn a woman's body into a sexual object, homosexual behavior, or the tragic number of marriage covenants that end in adultery. All of this has to be addressed by going back to design and purpose. Now, why is this perspective lost? It's lost because the church has, broadly speaking, accepted the culture's definition of marriage. That's the deeper malady. We must address that. Because once you accept the culture's definition of marriage, then of course all the conclusions flow out from that. In fact, we have very little ground to stand on. And all we do is kind of take it and tweak it. The proper narrative essentially is this: marriage, according to our culture, is a way to find personal fulfillment and to make you happy. I hope you're smiling. Marriage is defined, as the narrative goes, as a legal arrangement that allows two people to fulfill each other's emotional and sexual needs and desires. We value individual freedom, we value autonomy, and we put all of that within a larger utilitarian framework. And so today's endless presenting problems, and they're all important, but they are really a manifestation of that deeper malady, and that's what Jesus does. The church has unwittingly accepted the wider culture's view of marriage, and once you accept a functionalistic, commodity-driven, utilitarian view of marriage, then there's no place to stand in having these conversations, even internally or externally outside. So we cannot accept the prevailing presuppositions of a utilitarian consumer view of marriage. So what is the alternative? The alternative is a covenantal view of marriage. This is a big gulf between consumer and covenant. That's why Jesus goes back to creation. The consumer model says basically, as long as people are meeting your particular needs at an acceptable cost to us, then the relationships can go forward. When we cease to make a profit, that is to say, I'm putting this in crass terms, cease to make a profit, that is, where the relationship requires more love and affirmation from us than we are getting back, then we're entitled to cut our losses and drop the relationship. That's the commodification of marriage. Our social relationships are reduced to measurable economic and social emotional exchange units. And we think about things in those terms. And within this framework, marriage is fully privatized. It comes out of the public sphere. It certainly comes out of the sacred sphere. Ends up being about individual gratification and happiness. Things like the race, God's nature, producing character, sanctification, raising children, reflecting the triune God, becoming co-creators with God, all of that gets washed away in today's conversations. So slowly but surely, this new view of marriage has taken over and been taken root into the church. Tim Keller, I think recently, this was in this week's Christianity Today, I think beautifully revealed this problem when he was speaking to the Faith Angle Forum. I was a part of a forum similar to this a few years ago that we met in Boston. This is a forum that's designed to help the media better understand evangelicals. Have you realized there's a huge problem there? And the media has no distinction between like way out fundamentalist and evangelicals. It's all just one big, like, very scary blob to them. So we brought these news around the country together, had these conversations. And it's very interesting because journalists will highlight, like, for example, Terry Jones. Remember when Terry Jones threatened to burn the Quran? Okay, they have the CNN down there. They endlessly discuss. And Terry Jones becomes the poster child of evangelicalism. This guy has like 20 followers. Maybe. All right? So here you have, these major Christian leaders never heard of. I mean, Ken Collins, I don't know if Ken's here. Ken Collins writing a major book on evangelicalism. I'm not sure he's on like the Rolodex of the Boston Globe. Maybe you are, but should be. They just don't do that. They don't do that. And so this was a way of saying, okay, what about, have you ever thought about talking to Chuck Colson or to Rick Warren or to Ken Collins or anybody else about issues like this? So toward the end, Tim Keller was pressed about why evangelicals seem to be so adamantly against same-sex marriage. And his reply was exactly right on, though they had no idea what he was saying. He said, evangelical views are not understood because we don't understand sexual activity as a consumer good. That's what he said. He said, rather, we view sexual activity in marriage as self-donation, self-giving. He said, we believe that male and female have unique glories, and marriage must bring those two glories together. And it's not about our happiness, but a deeper glory. It's about a covenantal union where unlike genders are brought together into a one flesh relationship. That says it. That's exactly the recapturing that we have to have. Now, once we lose sight of the original design, then how can we oppose same-sex marriage, for example, or any other kind of relationship that is designed? Because after all, who are we to say why are we opposed to people who are happy? Two people find fulfillment. Who are we to oppose that? There's no ground to stand on once you accept the utilitarian view. But the biblical perspective is to bring us back to a covenantal view. Go back to the original design. Because if you don't do that, the conversation, like with the Pharisees, will already tacitly accept the endless broken presuppositions which bring the issue to the forefront to begin with. So when you're asked these questions, the first thing to do is to say, when someone says, what about this? What about that? What's your view of this? The first thing to say is, let's begin with a better question. What is God's design for marriage? That's the question. That's the question that Christ brings us to. Go back to creation, discover God's design. You discover a wonderful creational, covenantal, Eucharistic mystery of marriage. Verse 6, he says, God created us male and female. Our image reflects His image in the world. This is a re-establishment in every birth and rebirth of the image of God being recreated into the world. These glories coming together to a new glorious unity, just as Christ and the church are two glories being brought together as the body of Christ. Verse 7, Jesus says, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave or be united to his wife. Notice it's the man leaving, not the wife leaving. It's about going out and building something new. It's a new beginning, a new family unit that's developed. Verse 8, the two shall become one flesh. It's meant to be unitive. Two different genders becoming one in the covenant. And the sexual union produces children, reproducibility, fruitfulness, life. That's the biblical ethic of which marriage flows out of. So we have this joy of being co-creators with God as we build new families and children come forth. Not every marriage will, of course, produce children, but yet we ourselves are children. So therefore, we are part of this co-creation virtue of our very life in the world. The unitive, procreative aspects of marriage have always been central to the Christian teaching. It can't be compared to non-reproducible relationships. Verse 9, Jesus says, what God has put together, man should not separate. In other words, this is part of the heavenly design, reflects God's plan. This be put together. And when Paul discusses in Ephesians 5, he quotes this whole passage once again. He begins the passage by saying, be imitators of God. That's what marriage is. Yes, it joyfully does. It does bring us joy. God does bring us fulfillment in it, but it's the consequence of the covenant. It's not the foundation you build it upon. And that's the beautiful thing about marriage. It's not that God wants us to be miserably walking around, I'm in marriage because I'm being sanctified. But it's true, God does use your marriage to sanctify you. And if that doesn't do enough to sanctify you, He then gives you these things called children. God's greatest agents of sanctification in the world. I see someone in the back there bouncing their child. God bless you. I can remember it oh so well. Anyway, Paul goes on. This is a profound mystery. He says, a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery. And then he surprises us. He doesn't say, as you might expect, I'm talking about the mystery of the love of a man and a woman. That's what you might expect him to say, and that's true. But he has one better than that, doesn't he? He said, this is a profound mystery, but I'm speaking not about marriage. This whole marriage, I'm speaking about Christ and His church. That is the great covenantal point that Paul brings out to us. The very Trinitarian nature of God is brought out and reflected in the creational design. The family is meant to be a reflection of the Trinity with mutual gifts, mutual submission, joyful exercise of kingly and queenly authority, love, discipline, being co-creators with God. You see, the whole of creation, redemption, and the triune God is all brought into this beautiful relationship called marriage. And so, in this day, when the whole institution is crumbling around us, let us steadfastly remember God's design, and let's seek to go forth and build beautiful marriages that are holy and amaze the world. Amen.